You might not have had a chance to ask all of your questions to your neighbour, but I can already begin to hear conversations about your efforts to collaborate with different actors. I can hear examples being shared around the room, which is great. Does anyone want to just put their hand up if they felt, yeah, I'm scoring a lot of greens on my scorecards? Okay, you're very happy with your collaboration. That's great. That's great. Anyone else around the room thinking, yeah, this is actually I'm doing a lot of this already. This is good. Okay, so that's good. There's a lot of lessons for us to learn from each other. Zakir, please come over to please go over to Zakir to learn from him. He's really doing very well. So can I just encourage you to stop running through the scorecard right now, but please do take a couple, and continue with your colleagues back at home. And I'd now like to introduce my co-facilitator to come up and join me. Animesh Kumar, please do come up and join us. So Animesh has been very kind to join us from UNICR Asia and Pacific, and he's going to be running through now a bit of an introduction as to what Target-E actually is, and why it's important, and specifically why it's important that we achieve this target in an inclusive way. So, Animesh, thank you.
Okay, sorry to interrupt your very interesting discussion that you're having now. So, a very good morning. As I introduced, my name is Animesh Kumar. I am in the UNICR, UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, representing SLS Shimami Mizutori, who couldn't be here because she's very busy as of now, preparing for the ECOSOC forum in New York. I'm based in Bangkok at the Regional Office for Asia and Pacific, and in my presentation I will talk, demystify Target-E on national and local strategies, and also interesting features from the region, like we have recently done a survey with different governments, and the results of those survey are very interesting. It's actually similar indicators that is there on your scorecard that you're using. So it will be very interesting to see what the governments think and what the civil society thinks on the same issue, and how can they both be brought together. So, in my initial part of the presentation, I will talk a bit about Sendai framework, just to bring everyone on the same page, moving on towards Target-E, why is it important, and then moving on towards the status and implementation in this region. So just some headline figures. In the last 2 decades, or since the turn of the century, the world has recorded around 700 disasters per year, of which almost half were in Asia and Pacific region. It amounts to around 6,700 deaths per month, 60% in Asia Pacific. Over 500,000 affected people per day, 85% in Asia Pacific. We lost around $1.4 trillion in the last decade itself. And as per the latest report released late last week, last year in 2017, 30.6 million people were displaced globally, of which 60% were due to disasters running from natural hazards and 40% from conflicts. In Asia Pacific, that is around 30% of the total global displacements. So, from the last turn of the century, 2000 to 2017, if you look at the disasters in terms of the frequency of occurrence per year, you would see that there is more or less a declining trend. And this is often puts a bit of a green light to people. Okay, we're doing a very good job in terms of our disaster management practices. But there is a footnote to that, which is that these are threshold disasters. So disasters which have met a certain threshold so that they get into this database. And the threshold is defined by a certain criteria: more than 100 people affected, 10 people died, or the government declared an emergency. And if none of these happened, then it's not recorded in this international database. And then if we look at the threshold disasters, of course the trend globally appears that it's declining. But the picture is not so rosy. If you look at the low scales, at like high frequency, low impact disasters at the community level, the trend is exactly the reverse. And this is UNICR data for the same duration in 3 countries, Indonesia, Cambodia, and Myanmar. And these are the 3 countries from the region which have consistently recorded their community-based data. And the key difference between the left-hand side figure and the right one is that one is a threshold disaster and the other one is no threshold disaster. Every event which has happened at a community level has been recorded. And this is a glaring picture. The trend is actually increasing. And the simple thing which can be deciphered from these two graphs is that perhaps we have done well in terms of managing big-scale disasters or mega disasters, but when it comes to the community-based localized events, perhaps we haven't done very well. And then that points to the question that, are we looking at the disasters in the right way? If we look at the classical cycle of disaster risk management or disaster management, our focus on disasters start with an event. A disaster happened. We try to respond to it, we recover from it, we rehabilitate, we prepare for the next disaster, and in the process try to mitigate the impact. That classical model has been completely negated. It doesn't work, because that's not how disaster risk develops. The disaster risk is part of the DNA of development. And unless we look at disaster risk reduction from the development point of view, we will not achieve the desired results. And hence, this one that you're seeing in front is perhaps a new cycle of disaster risk management, where at the center is not an event, but sustainable development as the key parameter. And what we're trying to say here is that a development process which creates new risks cannot be sustainable. A development process which takes into account the risk that it may generate or that it may mitigate or that it may prevent is the right way of doing development. And just to give an example, one of the best examples of development practices is just perhaps construction of roads. But if a road is being constructed through an ecosystem fragile area, we are creating environmental risks. And then we will do DRR to mitigate those risks. This is not sustainable. Why can't we do development in a way that does not create new risks, but also mitigates the risks which are present? This is the nucleus of Sendai framework. The Sendai framework, endorsed exactly 3 years back in March 2015, focuses on preventing new risks and reducing existing disaster risk, and in the process, developing resilience. We believe that if we reduce our exposure to hazards, reduce the vulnerability of systems and communities and nations to hazards, and enhance our preparedness, we are actually developing resilience. And there comes national and local strategies. One of the key defining moments of the Sendai framework was the targets themselves, which the predecessor Hyogo framework for action missed. There are 7 targets in the Sendai framework, and the 5th target is the unique target and the only target which needs to be achieved by 2020, while all other targets have a bigger timeline they need to achieve by 2030. And this was necessitated because we have just done a paradigmatic shift from reactive crisis management to a more proactive risk management. And hence, we feel that unless we have our strategies right, we will not be able to do it. So the definition of the DRM strategy itself, as given by the Open-Ended Intergovernmental Expert Working Group endorsed by the UN General Assembly in 2016, is last year in February actually, is in terms of the same definition that I just mentioned, a strategy which prevents creation of new risk, reduces existing risk, and enhances and strengthens resilience, is the kind of DRM strategy we are talking about. The core principles of the new series of DRM strategies that we are talking about is that, of course, the Sendai framework vests the primary responsibility of its implementation with the governments, but of course, it's a shared responsibility with all the stakeholders, including all of us. It has to be aligned with the Sendai framework global priorities, 4 of them, and the 7 targets. It has to focus on risk-informed development, which was just defined in the last couple of slides. The coherence across multiple agendas is very important. I mean, during 2015 to 16, within a duration of 1.5 years, different international agreements were endorsed. And this is a very unique moment because this will not come back in the next 15 to 20 years. This gives an opportunity to create coherence across multiple international agreements, and we have taken a few very concrete steps to ensure this. The joint monitoring of SDG and Sendai monitoring is just one small step in this direction. So just 2 months back, 54 governments globally have submitted their SDG report to us on disaster-related 11 indicators, and we have submitted to DESA in the UN for SDG monitoring. And inclusiveness, that's a key parameter that we're trying to define with the strategy, which will be very relevant for this group in terms of ensuring that there is an equal or equitable participation of different key stakeholders. So why inclusive DRR strategies? So let's just pause a bit on inclusiveness. Recently, World Bank did a study and found that the OECD countries, the high-income countries in the world, have recorded 52 times greater income disparity compared to the low-income countries. In fact, in some of the low-income countries, over two dozens, per capita wealth actually declined or stagnated over the last several years. At the same time, during the same duration, the low and middle-income country in Asia Pacific lost 15 times more people than the high-income countries in the region. Put both of them together, we're talking about the inequalities that the disaster risk and economic inequalities generate across space. Now look across the vertical inequalities. Within the high-income, middle-income, and low-income countries, the low levels of social expenditure, capital expenditure, have created inequalities over time, which actually accentuate risk and vulnerability. So within these high-income, middle-income, and low-income countries, there are communities which have a disproportionate level of risk compared to the higher income groups within the same country. And then the frequent disasters, which I was showing in the graph, actually have deepened such inequalities and then disproportionately affect the more marginalized and vulnerable communities. This creates a vicious cycle of poverty, inequality, and disaster risk. And hence, the Sendai framework, when it talks about DRR as a primary responsibility, also says that it's a shared responsibility with the stakeholders. Civil society in particular would provide specific knowledge in the context of development and implementation of frameworks, standards, and plans for DRR. That's where the target E lies. Also in terms of engaging at the local, national, regional levels and global for plans and strategies. The DRR strategies, policies, and plans have to be gender sensitive, and the commitments that the stakeholder groups have made in the World Conference in 2015 and also in different regional conferences are very important to ensure that these strategies are implemented. The point being here that the inequalities that I had pointed out in the previous slide can be mitigated only well if the communities are engaged, and the communities can be engaged only if the civil society is engaged in this process of developing the DRR strategies, both at the national and local level. Now I'll just spend another 5 minutes in quickly showcasing some of the results of the survey we recently did across 22 countries in this region. So this is a snapshot that where Asia Pacific has achieved in which indicators and where the progress has not been as high. So in terms of public awareness and advocacy, including translation of global frameworks into local languages, the region has done reasonably very well. I mean, that's the highest figure that we have received. Most of the countries in the region, as also is the case with many other countries in the world, have very good established national platforms, which is a good coordination mechanism. And almost all the countries in this region have a national DRR strategies and plans. I put a question mark there, and that's for a reason, and I'll come back to it in the next slide. The low progress has been made in terms of risk knowledge. I mean, we don't have adequate baselines to measure our progress. The Sendai framework requires us to establish the baselines to see if we are making progress. We just don't have enough data to measure the progress because we don't have the baselines. I'm not even going into the sex and age disaggregated data because there was no disaggregation done in the past. The review on Sendai monitoring continues to be low. I would say 54 countries was a good success parameter given the fact that countries had very less time to report in March. I would say, but that's just 1/4 of the countries in the world. So perhaps we have to do much better on that. In terms of the mechanisms on risk knowledge itself, do the countries have a framework on risk data collection, analysis, and dissemination? Hardly any country has that. And then the local platform is something which I will come back in the next presentation in terms of, but that's where I see the role of the civil society much stronger than in the national level. So that's a bit of a figure. We had put a milestone in the Asia Ministerial Conference in 2016 in India of that all the countries in the region would have, 40% of the countries would have developed national DRR strategies and plans. So almost every country said that yes, we do have a policy or a strategy or a legislation. And some of them also talked about local DRR or disaster management plans and strategies. but an analysis of the actual quality of the plans and legislation and strategies shows that very few of them are actually aligned with the theme, with the heart of the Sendai framework. They're still very much yoga framework, preparedness plans, response plans, or contingency plans. During 2016 and 17, and that's a green light here, that many of the countries have started processes to actually revise their existing strategies and policies in line with the Sendai framework, and some of them have actually defined to legislative backing, as in the case of Nepal recently. But again, merely structuring a national plan or a strategy around the 4 priorities of the Sendai framework doesn't necessarily mean that the key question of risk-informed development is being addressed. So that remains a question mark. But then we have some very good examples, including one from Philippines, where long-term development plans and disaster risk management strategies have been recently developed. We also have a few action plans, in particular from the Pacific, of integrated DRM climate change plans. Also, many countries have started moving their disaster risk management portfolio from an emergency focus to a more development planning ministry. This change of institutions has been very, very concrete actually in Africa, much more than in Asia. I was in Africa for the last 10 years and just recently moved to Asia, and I've seen during the 10 years at least 18 countries shifted their disaster management portfolio from an emergency management based organization to the heads of state offices or to at least a ministry which has coordination functions. Alignment with the Sendai framework hence remains a bit of a question mark here. I hope that we will move forward as the new guidelines start coming in. And also, when we talk about risk-informed development, we also question the countries in terms of what are we doing to ensure that the risk-informed development is actually being implemented. We had some very interesting results here. And many of the countries mentioned that they are developing long-term development plans, which has DRR as a core component. And many of them have mentioned that they actually have disaster management plan, which have development goals included. So it actually works both ways, and some countries have both. It got more interesting when the countries gave examples of how actually they are doing risk-informed development. Several countries in this region have pointed to resilient infrastructure as a means to ensure that risk-informed development is actually happening, which is very interesting. I mean, in the coming 20-30 years, we estimate that $57 trillion will be invested in the new infrastructure. Majority of this growth will happen in Asian countries where the growth and urbanization is at the highest level. If this infrastructure is not resilient, it will create new risks. It will not sustain itself. And hence there is a big opportunity here to ensure that the new infrastructure that is being generated is risk-proof. Some countries also pointed out integration of risk elements into land use planning or building codes, river basin management at the regional level. So we do have different ways to approach risk-informed development. All the countries who reported to us mentioned that the implementation of risk-informed development is subject to availability of data. And that's where, again, we get stuck. We don't have the data. If we don't have the data, we can't actually ensure that that data gets informed or integrated into the development policies. So what is UNISDR doing? I mean, we are the custodian organization of the Sendai framework. We serve as the focal point on disaster risk reduction in the UN system. So far, what we have done since the Sendai framework, we have come out with a capacity development strategy, which is almost nearing its finalization, to provide training modules for focusing on the government officials to begin with. And since we have started this process, since the Sendai framework, over 1,000 government officials have been trained. We also serve as a kind of a platform to exchange good practices, including through our regional and global platforms. We have developed a technical guidance notes to better understand the Sendai Framework Monitor, besides many other supplementary guidelines, and of course we do organize our usual global and regional platforms. A very good point to mention here and relevant is in terms of the Words into Action guidelines. We are coming out with a series of Words into Action guidelines on different topics concerning the Sendai framework. What we have released so far are for consultation. We have come out with the local DRR strategies couple of months back. That's the one you're seeing on the screen. We also have come out with the National Disaster Risk Assessment Guidelines. So both of these are out for consultation. So please Feel free to provide your feedback, including through us. The national DRR strategy is almost completion, and we should be able to release it very soon in the coming week or so. And if things go on well, it could be released in the Asian Ministerial Conference next month, or 42 days from now. We also have series of relevant guidelines. Also, we have released for consultation, which are relevant for the discussion on technological hazards, national local platforms, disaster preparedness, recovery, simulation exercises, and displacement. One is again something which is being released, is under discussion and will be released very soon. These words into action are going through a consultative process, again ensuring that all your inputs are included before they are finally published for actual implementation. I would stop here and open invitation to all of you to the Asian Ministerial Conference that I just mentioned, happening 42 days from now, 36th of July, Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. This will be, we organize these conferences regionally in Asia Pacific every 2 years. This one will be a very unique one, being organized in a landlocked developing country, Mongolia, and will be resulting in a declaration and an action plan to what to do to achieve Target E in this region in the next 1.5 years by 2020. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Animesh. I'm now just going to very quickly share some of the results of a survey that GNDR conducted with its members about the extent to which civil society is engaging in the design of these strategies. It's clear that if CSOs do input the local knowledge, the local capacities into this process, then we can help ensure that these strategies are appropriate, that they effectively build resilience for vulnerable groups, but also critically that they're locally owned. It'll help build that buy-in for local implementation. So we went out and asked our membership about their engagement in the DRR strategy processes that needs to be achieved by 2020. And 48 of the 68 members that we spoke to reported that their country has a national DRR strategy, so well on the way towards the target. But 25 of those reported that government was regularly engaging civil society in discussion when developing their DRR strategy. So a proportion, a quarter of these are seeing regular engagement of civil society when they're developing their DRR strategy, but still quite a long way to go. And 42% reported that regular engagement with civil society was due to a national platform, that they were able to engage through their national platforms for DRR. And interestingly, when we delved a little bit deeper, it seems that all of those national platforms had multiple seats for civil society, more than 6 in all cases. And a small percentage talked about how, unfortunately, those national platforms, though, only had space for international NGOs and not the local or national NGOs. Just a couple of examples of stories that we heard in our survey. So here, a member from Malawi reported that the DRR policy provides for a structured consultative mechanism from the village level up to the national level. And they gave the example of this really recent meeting that had happened, the National Disaster Preparedness and Relief Technical Committee meeting, just a month ago, where civil society from across the country was invited to feed into the revisions of the policy. We also got a response from Romania that said that the emergency department invited CSOs to nominate candidates for their national DRR platform and outlined a calendar of consultation, and that this calendar of when you're going to be engaged and why and how was really useful. We then asked about local DRR strategies, and 63% of the people we asked reported that there was a local DRR strategy in the areas that they worked, but we got a lot of caveats shared. And a lot of people saying, well, there's a local strategy in some of the villages I work in, but not in others. We heard that in some countries there were DRR strategies at the province level, but not down to the village level, and that this was desperately needed. And we heard quite a few comments about differences in whether there were local DRR strategies in rural areas compared to urban areas. So that's another area that I think there's some difference. So we just wanted to pause for a second and check in with you guys and ask whether these results and the information shared by Animesh is ringing true for you. Is this what you are seeing in your country? I'd like to hear from some people in the room about the design of DRR strategies, both national and local level, and whether you've been able to engage. So, would anyone like to share? Yes? Pepe? 1, 2, 3.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. So one of the good practice in Indonesia is that, as what Animesh said, that UNISDR, they provide trainings to the national government, like on how they can do the local government self-assessment tools and to generate the DRR action planning, DRR strategy and action planning. And there is a good initiative from the National Agency for Disaster Management where they invited the CSO to be part of the training. And after the training, the CSO, the trained CSO, they will facilitate the like for example the Sendai local urban indicators assessments, and then together with the local disaster management agency and also the local CSO, so that the process could be more participatory. And and also that before they do the consultations, they will identify who are the CSO and who are the private sectors, and also who are the community platform that should be invited in the meeting. So I think it's very good that, and it would be great if it can be replicated in another country as well, that UNISDR also engage CSO in the training, not only from the government, and do the collaborative works at local level with national and local CSO.
So a fantastic example there of UNISDR bringing different stakeholders together on training for the implementation of the Sendai framework. And Happy has almost invited you all there to come and flood to her at the lunch break and talk about this best practice and think about how you can replicate this in your own countries. So I think we had one here and one here. Sorry, Sawa, yeah, and then I think Bob.
I'm Sarwani from Pakistan. I think as far as the national level strategy is concerned, it has been there for many, many years. As you go to the grassroots level, it doesn't exist, especially at the district level. It needs, but the district is a very big, again, administrative unit. We need to go to union council level at least, or village. But there is a serious lacuna as far as the legislation is concerned in Pakistan, because there is a National Disaster Management Act which talks about the responsibility of the Union Council to about DRR and DRM. But then there is a Local Government Act which does not give this responsibility to the local government. So we have been taking up this issue with the government that you have to resolve this contradiction within the legislation. And unless that is done, the local governments are not going to take up this issue at all. They can refuse, but this is not their responsibility.
Okay, so we've heard from Sama there a bit of a reality that there's a challenge because there's a lack of clarity of roles in this process between local government, national government, different types of local governments. So that's a really interesting one. Let's keep that in mind as a reality for us to bear in mind. I think we have one over here, and then Guian, and then I think we'll have to move on. But we'll bring up more time for questions.
Hello, Falak Nawaz from Pakistan. In fact, I will compliment comments from Bari Saab as he mentioned about the National Disaster Management Act. We have National Disaster Management Plan which we have developed to from 2012 to 2022. And then also we have national implementation framework for that how we will implement that plan. There is definitely question mark that how much it is going further to the district level, as Bari mentioned. But there is like good progress also, like for example, these days we can see that from provincial level disaster management plans has been formed. Based on that national disaster management plan, and provincial disaster management plans also being formed, developing these days. And then also district disaster management plans. So a lot of work, like for example, these days only if we take Punjab province, there are 20 disaster prone districts where district disaster management plans has been formed. That is the main question, that how much the government is taking seriously to implement that plan at the district level. That is the laguna which also Bari mentioned, that is still, that gap is there. Probably maybe lack of resources or maybe lack of awareness or whatever, but these are implementing. And that is developed by the civil societies in fact. All these plans has been developed with the collaboration of civil societies, but then there is a gap, big gap, that it sometimes become only a plan putting in a cupboard and then not implementing. That is the question.
Okay, so we've heard from Falak two challenges there, I think. I mean, first of all, it's great to hear that civil society is engaging in your country in this process. So there's a lot of lessons that you might want to share later. But there's a challenge that you mentioned there of just how many districts there are. There's just so much work to be done. And that must be a quite a big burden for the government, as well as all the other actors that want to get involved. And then you mentioned also that that there's, these are very at-risk areas, and they're having to respond at the same time as having to prepare these plans. There's a lot of other priorities going on in these areas as well. I said to Guillaume would be able to share. I'm afraid I can't come to everyone, but there will be another portion for you to be able to share in the country.
So first, it's more a question for UNISDR. If I understand well, the Sendai framework is of government and different stakeholders, including the civil society and civil society organization. But if I read correctly, maybe I'm wrong, monitoring is a government responsibility. Civil society organization in the official framework is not involved in the monitoring. So could you explain to me?
That was a question to Animesh, right?
The question is, officially in the document from UN on the monitoring is a government, and civil society organization are not involved in the process of monitoring. Yeah. So maybe I'm wrong. I would like to hear if I'm wrong.
So Animesh, actually, if you'd like to come up and join me, because I think you're on next anyway, perhaps you could answer this question from Guillaume on the stage. Oh, we're all walking.
So yeah, thanks for that question. It's you're right. The primary role of reporting on Sendai framework monitoring is with the governments. Now it all depends on the governments and how much they engage with the civil society in developing those reports. So that's the key question. The accountability is with the government. The responsibility of reporting can be shared, but the accountability cannot be. That's the key point here. Now what I mean by that is that we can't hold everyone sitting in the room accountable. There has to be accountability set, and that accountability as set by the Sendai framework is with the government. The responsibility can be shared because, for example, in multiple countries, when the countries have reported on DRR progress, including through the Hugo framework reporting erstwhile, the national platform was heavily engaged in development of the reports. And once national platform is engaged in development of the reports for reporting to for these international agreements, then that's the place where the civil society